Mary, take it away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Being Trafficked, What You Need to Know About Being in the Life. Today's webinar is hosted by AEquitas. My name is Mary McLeod. I am an Associate Attorney Advisor at AEquitas, and I will be introducing today's webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the chat box. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar with time permitting. You are also welcome to contact us directly at any time following today's presentation, and we will send you the contact information during our follow-up. AEquitas's mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. As a national training and technical assistance provider, AEquitas develops resources, conducts trainings, and offers 24/7 consultations for prosecutors and allied professionals. For more information on AEquitas, please visit our website at equitasresource.org. You can also follow AEquitas on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The link to each is available on our website. Today's presentation is the inaugural webinar for the Just Exits Initiative, supported by the Novo Foundation. The Just Exits Initiative is transforming justice by closing on-ramps to and building off-ramps from exploitation. We do this by educating prosecutors and law enforcement about the realities of sexual exploitation and trafficking, supporting efforts to improve our responses to exploited women and girls, including making sure that they are not criminalized, collaborating to improve survivors' access to appropriate services, and making sure that our work is something that can be measured and replicated. Today's presenters will be Jane Anderson, Wendy Barnes, and Keisha Head. Jane, I'll now hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Mary, and welcome to everyone. We keep allowing in some more folks, and I'm happy to see so many of you interested in this program. My name is Jane Anderson. I'm an attorney advisor with AEquitas. Prior to joining AEquitas, I served as a prosecutor in Miami-Dade County, where I had the privilege of starting our human trafficking task force, which ultimately became a human trafficking unit. I was lucky enough to try many of Florida's first human trafficking cases. And along the way, I learned so much from those in the field, including amazing survivor leaders, victim service professionals, and others. Now I serve as an attorney advisor, which allows me to help others around the country that are doing this work, including many of the human trafficking task forces that are funded through various grants. So that kind of gives me this great national perspective that I hope others find helpful. But really the stars of today's presentation are my co-presenters, Wendy Barnes and Keisha Head. So proud to be presenting this with them. And Wendy, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself a little bit to the group.
Okay, thank you, Jane. My name is Wendy Barnes. I am the coordinator for the Human Trafficking Response Program at Dignity Health. That is where we provide education on human trafficking to physicians, nurses, all healthcare providers in the hospital on how to identify and respond to victims of human trafficking. The reason that I am so passionate about this program is that I am a survivor of sex trafficking. And while I was trafficked for over 13 years, I had many visits with doctors, nurses, clinics, hospitals. I had 3 children with my trafficker. So, I get to bring a lot of my own experiences to help educate the people in that field. So, Keisha?
Thanks, Wendy. My name is Keisha Head. I'm the lead case manager for Salvation Army Haven Atlanta program. And I have been in the anti-trafficking movement for over 10 years now, starting in juvenile justice. And I also bring to the table my experience of being trafficked and also navigating various systems such as foster care. And I'm just excited to be here and share with you guys.
Thanks, guys. So overall, our objectives today are really to think about those factors that impact the push into the life, right? Those things that allow folks to be vulnerable or that systems that failed and then leave people getting easily recruited into the life. The next piece is going to be about articulating the realities, what it actually looks like. And I think this is going to be really important to those of you that are working in the field and are trying to articulate that to maybe judges or service providers or law enforcement. And then ultimately thinking about how we're going to maximize those off ramps, which include providing meaningful and accessible opportunities to help people transition from the life. So caveats before we start, we're going to talk about some common experiences, and we're really lucky enough to have Wendy and Keisha here to share a little bit about their lived experience as well as their professional ones. But this isn't necessarily consistent with everyone's experience, right? Human trafficking has a lot of different permutations, including labor trafficking. Victims can be of all genders, all nationalities. But today we're really going to be focusing on domestic sex trafficking of women and girls. If you'd like more resources on other types of trafficking, AEquitas is always here for you, and we can provide those as well. So I'm going to pitch this to you, Keisha, first off. We refer to it as the life. What does this mean to you?
I'm going to start by reading from the definition of Renning Lacey by Linda Smith. The subculture of prostitution, complete with rules, a hierarchy of authority and language, referring to the act of pimping as the game, gives the illusion that it can be fun and easy way to make money, when the reality is much harsher. Women and girls will say that they've been in the life if they've been involved in prostitution for a while. For me personally, I look at the life as a combination of slavery and a cult, where there is a hierarchy and governance, and there's a leader with a godlike complex, and there's a lot of brainwashing that goes into it, fear tactics, and other similar things.
So we're going to talk first about sort of life before the life, right? And I think there are many underlying factors. We're going to kind of focus in on 4 of them, starting off with racism and then going into the adverse childhood experiences and how they affect our brains and our ability to thrive. And we'll talk a little bit about the systematic factors, and then generally just sort of lack of opportunity and what that means to folks. So I'm going to start, Keisha. I know this is a piece that you're really interested in explaining in more detail, if you don't mind.
Yes, because I'm a person of color who has been trafficked, and understanding our country and where slavery created this social construct for trafficking to exist. And coming from me being the 4th generation born into poverty, and coming from that, I had to really look deep into my own experiences of how and why this happened to me. So I began to do a little research and go into the different myths and misconceptions about me as a young Black girl when I was trafficked, being a young Black girl in a society that looked at me as a sexual deviant, as a criminal versus a child in need of services and in deep trouble within my community. And there's a research that comes out of UCLA by Cheryl Nelson Butler that goes into detail about white supremacy constructed the myth of Black women as Jezebel. And what that really means is during slavery, used to justify sexual and economic explanation, as well as furthering slavery's central purpose to degrade, dehumanize, and subjugate. And also the systems, and this is very important because you have to make those connections into where we are now, whereas mass incarceration and all of those come from a system that hysterically has come from slavery. So we have to understand that how people of color are viewed within the judicial system differs from any other race of people. And we also, as Black women and children, are pushed into like for me, I really felt that there was like a gravitational push into trafficking, all the way down from the influences from my music that I listened to. Everything told me that I was a sexual object. And you began to create these viewpoints about yourself, and society tell you that's what you're created for. And so you begin to believe those things. So way before I got to my trafficker, I was already groomed through society to be prepared for trafficking.
That's really interesting. And I saw in this research that it kind of goes even broader about just general sexual colonization and stereotyping.
Yes, it also, there also are stereotypes for Indigenous, Asian, and Latino women into trafficking as well. And these create these fetishes for, make them look exotic, or just so that buyers make them, just from who they are. Asian women, especially, we see this in the salons and the spas where they're sexually exploited. So there are these subcultures within our society that, especially Indigenous women, and we don't hear about it a lot. So the research is very interesting. I encourage everyone to go read the paper so they can understand the connections and to where we are today.
Yeah, and I pulled this quote from a research in Minnesota, and it's talking specifically, like you said, about the Native girls being specifically targeted, and because they're determined, or they're thought of as being really versatile, because they can be posted online as Asian or Hawaiian Native, or whatnot. And so I think that really speaks to what you're talking about, of that fetishization. I can't say it, but you know what I'm saying about a fetish, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree.
So we'll be happy to make this research available to any of you. You'll have access to the PowerPoints as well. And here's just a snapshot of some other research that really shows the disproportionate effect of sex trafficking on Black, Latina, and Asian and Natives within the United States. And you'll see that looking at those that identify as engaging in sex work in New York, really disproportionate number of Black and Latina there. Participants in the human trafficking intervention courts, 32% Asian, almost all foreign national, and those are probably almost entirely due to operations conducted in massage businesses. Again, in just a review overall of 2 years of human trafficking incidents, we have that same high rate of Black and Latina victims. And then these are kind of interesting in South Africa, or excuse me, South Dakota, Cook County, and Nebraska. They not only showed the percentage, but then they show that in relation to their population. So in South Dakota, 40% of the victims were Native American, while the population of Native Americans within South Dakota is only 8%. You see that same huge difference when we look at those in Nebraska, where 50% of the victims are identified as Black, but their population only consists of 5%. Now, turning that all on its head, I also wanted to include the last research. Comes from an amalgamation of several studies that all sort of put the percentage of buyers as 80 to 85% being white men. So I think that really reinforces a lot of what you were sharing, Keisha. So Wendy, I'm hoping you can kind of move us in from your medical experience and talk to us a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences.
I can. So just to give a little bit of background of what the ACEs is and where it came from. So in 1995, Kaiser Permanente and the CDC joined together to create a study on the lasting effects of adverse childhood experiences. They used 17,000 participants, and after their yearly regular exam. And so just to clarify, these people are not ones that are going, these are not poor people. These are people with HMOs. They have jobs, regular middle class or even upper class America living in San Diego. After their yearly exam, they got a survey asking about their childhood experiences. Based on those, they could tell how many health problems they would have later on in life. Go ahead and flip this slide here. Let me see it. So the environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as growing up in a household with substance misuse, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation or household members being in jail or prison. But it doesn't necessarily have to be these horrible situations that are happening. I mean, some of the questions are, were you left at home alone a lot? Did you feel loved? I know for me, the 4 factors that contributed to me being vulnerable to a trafficker when I was 15 years old was bullying, parental absence, poverty, and child sexual abuse. I'll tell you, a lot of people, when I tell them that, they automatically assume that the child sexual abuse is what probably brought on most of my problems. And honestly, the one that was so detrimental to me and long lasting was the bullying. Being bullied was, it left me feeling very lost, alone, and unloved, and a perfect target for a predator. Go ahead, flip the page there. So some of the lasting effects on health, sexually transmitted infections.
I think we lost you there, Wendy.
Technology.
Well, we'll kind of wait to see if Wendy can reconnect. But I know that what she'd want to share with you really is that these are lasting negative effects, and they can be long-term over your entire life. And sex trafficking and the involvement in sex trafficking is one that's been particularly highlighted by the research. And you can find this on the CDC's website. It's linked in these slides. But it also talks about not just ACEs sort of in a vacuum, but the fact that when you have ACE factors, and then you combine those with other factors like under-resourced neighborhoods and racially segregated neighborhoods and frequent moving around, that instability, along with food insecurity, all of these things create toxic stress. And toxic stress actually changes our abilities for our brain to develop correctly. And the things that we see are things like problems focusing, problems making decisions, paying attention, just learning and responding to stress. So I think when I see all of this research and then I combine it with what Keisha was saying, I think it really does speak to that idea of sort of that gravitational pull of like, not being able to make decisions, not being able to be learning, and you're sitting in school and you're hungry, right? And so you end up being difficult having healthy and stable relationships, right? This is sort of the natural progression of that, this ability to, take care of your finances. You're struggling with your job, you're struggling with depression, and it can actually be something that you can pass on to your children. So when we look at all this together, and then we combine it with the systematic factors, we're really looking at, the life before the life. And Keisha, you touched on it in your intro. I'm wondering if you'll share a little bit more about your experience with the foster care system and response to your family that was in crisis.
Well, I was born to a schizophrenic mother. So from the very beginning, I was in survival mode. I was placed with an aunt, and about year 12, she had really, a lot of things had happened inside the home. There was constant sexual abuse from her sons, and she was a recent divorcee. It was just too much for her and me. And she decided to put me into foster care. Well, it was just pack my bags, put all my clothes in trash bags, and sent me to my mom's house. And my mom, due to her mental illness, it took 6 months before child services picked up that I was a child that needed to be in care. So, and just like that, I was placed into foster care. And from the age of 12 to 16, I was shifted through 42 different placements. And for me, it was just unreal. Here I was, a 12-year-old who had a life, grew up in church, had friends, had school, went to the same school, like everything was the same. And then one day it changed and I did not know how to handle that. And I began to spiral and just being shifted through those placements without anyone explaining to me what was going on. I really felt like I was invisible, and it really took a toll on my mental health. I began to disassociate. I began to just be disruptive. I was never never had behavioral problems. I began to have behavioral problems, fighting, anger issues, and it just went downhill from there. And that was my response. So by the time I met my trafficker, so many things had already happened to me. I had a child at the age of 16. I had lost my child just like my mom had lost me. So I was going through so many emotional breakdowns, and also running away. I ran away a lot. And a lot of times when I was on a run, other things would happen. I was raped once. Just very traumatic things began to happen. So by the time I met my trafficker, I had already experienced a great deal of trauma.
Yeah, and you touched on a bunch of these systematic factors too, right? Because your housing is necessarily connected to the foster care.
Mhm.
The response that you had, or the lack of response you had to violence, is connected to all of this as well, and family and social and child services. So you can
Most
see how
definitely.
yeah, all these systems kind of interact. And I know Wendy's struggling to get back in. She lost power. She's letting me know. But she was sharing with us when we were preparing for this that, growing up in a home with a single mom, she went to get assistance for welfare services at the time, and was told that, her mom made $2 more an hour than she could to receive any services. So that bright line of $2, cut that family off from needed services. And when you have those needs that we all have, that can be really impactful. And Wendy's joining just in time. I'm going to put Wendy on the spot. Wendy, we were just going through some of the systematic factors, right? And I shared the story that you were sharing with us about your mom and the $2. And it brings us all to this slide, which is sort of, we all have these wants and needs, right? Including housing and shelter and food and heat. But what happens when you pair that with a vulnerability as well?
Is this where I jump in? I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yes.
my whole entire power went out in the house. So, okay. So a really good analogy to use for this one is, we all have wants and needs. And there are one group of people that can get to their wants and needs, because they ask their family members or whatever, they're able to achieve them. Other people cannot. If I am unable to get this need that I want, it puts me in a vulnerable situation. Being vulnerable, there is this desperate feeling. Just try and think back for a moment of any time in your life that you were desperate. You weren't able to process information. Your thinking patterns were not logical sometimes. I guess a really good analogy is, imagine you are out hiking and you veer off, a path, your foot.
Ah, Wendy. Oh,
I can continue it.
yeah, good. Because
The analogy is, you're on this path, and your foot slips and you begin to fall. And as you're falling, you you don't have time to think, let me grab onto this branch or let me grab onto this rock, because you're in your decline, like you're falling. And sometimes that's how it is when you are in desperate situations. You just grab onto the first thing that's readily available to you. And sometimes it's the trafficker, or sometimes if you're a drug addict, it's a drug. So, and the person on top, there's always somebody on top that's going to say, oh, you should have did this, or you should have grabbed onto the tree instead of that rock. So, but in the decline of it, you don't have time to process. And that's what survival mode is also. And those desperate situations lead you to exploitation. I can even clarify for me, those 6 months being with my mom, not having food, and her not being mentally, like I was used to somebody having my clothes ready when I woke up. I was used to my lunch being prepared. I was used to dinner. I was used to brush your teeth, comb your hair. I mean, those instructions, none of that existed anymore. And then it got to a point where she wasn't even feeding me. And I would go out into the community and meet men. I lost my virginity within that 6 months. And began to make very desperate desperate decisions that led to exploitation. And for me, that was all from 12 until my adult years. That same pattern existed over and over again.
So well done, Keisha, picking up. Wendy would be proud.
Thank you, Keisha. Yeah, I don't know what's happening. Our power just keeps going on and off. So something's happening in Orange County.
We'll struggle along with you because the next piece I really want to make sure we get you guys' input. It's really just that point of entry, right? Where that happened in your life. And oftentimes it's a person, right? That forms that point of contact, point of entry. Wendy, I don't know if you're around to share a little bit about that with your experience.
Yeah, I mean, mine was intimate partner. I was 15 years old. As I said before, I felt lost, alone, and unloved in the world. And he was the first person that ever showed interest in me. He paid attention to me. He gave me what I needed, and that was to feel special and to feel loved, because I did not get that from my parents. And then he, you know, basically he groomed me. He took a very long time to groom me, having a baby with him. And then that is what he used as his coercion to get me out onto the street is, if you love your daughter, this is what you're willing to do. You know, she needs diapers, she needs formula. If you are a good mother, you know, if you really loved your child, you would be willing to do anything for her.
Keisha?
For me, I remember I was in this group home, and at this point I had ran away so much I had began to deplete all of my resources. And my case manager, she had told me, if you mess up this placement, the only other place we have is a mental institution, and that's where you'll be until you're 18. At the time I was 16. So long story short, I ended up getting into a fight, losing the placement. And before she could come pick me up, I ended up running. And I stayed on the streets for quite some time, and in abandoned apartments and things, but it was the winter time, and I ended up reaching out to a childhood friend, and I told her my situation. And we had grew up in church with each other, and I felt she was a very safe person who could really help me. And so I went over her house, and she told me she knew someone who could help me. And she said, she wanted to introduce me to someone. So we went to Atlanta and pulled up to a club called Dream Girls. And she introduced me to Sir Charles, which was the trafficker, and she left. And that is how I was introduced to him, just that moment in desperation and reaching out to someone.
And I think those stories really illustrate, you know, two really common ways. One is somebody within your your social circle, the other an intimate partner. We know that others experience that point of entry through family, And a lot of attention is also on the fact that social media can play a part in that point of entry, especially if that social media then turns into perhaps somebody that's posing as a friend or an intimate partner. So this is sort of the recruitment pattern that I've seen in the work that I did, and I know when we were talking, it also matched up with your experiences, but in kind of two different ways. So Keisha, playing off that the story you started, can you talk a little bit about how that recruitment actually happened?
Yes. So when my friend left, me and Sir Charles took a ride in his Mercedes, and I call it down the rabbit hole experience. It was my down the rabbit hole. If I would have known what life would look like after that moment, I would have never gotten in that car. But in the car, I began to tell him, I think I had reached a point where I was just tired. I was 4 years of being in a system that and feeling invisible. I just needed someone to hear me. So I began to tell him every single detail about myself from the very beginning, and how I just wanted my daughter. I just needed to see her. And I just began to cry. And he looked at me and said, you're so beautiful. You don't have to live like this. I mean, and he took me to get my daughter. We began, and for me, I bonded with him instantly. And then I went back to his house, and there were other girls, and they looked at me. It was like, what you got on? And they began to give me clothes and do my hair and my makeup. And it just felt like a family. And that was something that I desperately needed at the moment. Just like that, it took 3 days from the time of meeting Sir Charles and being on the track. So later that night, he took me back to Dream Girls, and I began to strip, made money that night. And on day 3, he told me, I can't take you to Dream Girls anymore because you're underage. So I have to take you. He took me to Metropolitan and began to tell me what I needed to do on the track in 3 days. I went from Keisha, quiet, shy, to Keisha on the track.
Does this pattern sort of mirror what you experienced as well, Wendy?
Yes. So I think, I already kind of explained how my trafficker took his time to find out what I needed. He wanted to know what I liked, what I didn't like. He really took the time to figure out what tools he could use against me. I think for my dream that he identified as, I just wanted a loving family. My mom was now on her 3rd marriage. I wanted a forever family. And so his dream for me was, we're going to raise a family together. We're going to grow old together. We're going to have all these kids together. I can tell you, traffickers are very, very good at what they do. They know how to identify what a person's needs and wants are, and knows how to manipulate those. For instance, I'll just tell you, there was this one girl that I didn't find this out until actually a couple of years ago. One of the girls that he had recruited and brought into the prostitution ring, he met her at it was called Wild Waves up in Federal Way, Washington, a water park. And she was 11 years old. He was, I think, 30 at the time. They exchanged telephone numbers. And he would just call her about once every 3 weeks or 3 months. Every 3 months, hey, how you doing? Just talking, listening to her. Every 3 months, he would just call and say, how you doing? Check in with her. After 2 years, he just was sitting there waiting for her to get into a fight with her mom. And then, she called him up, my mom, we're in a fight. And he swooped in to be the rescue.
Patience.
Yes.
But I think this is what they're really good at, right? Is they're good at listening, being patient, and then identifying the need. And I think it can be the basics of, I need some place to stay, I need a place to sleep, I need a home, to I want friendship, I want intimacy, I want that sense of family, I want self-esteem or status or recognition either. So any of those needs, we all have them. And if they're not being met, it's really an opportunity for an exploiter to identify and then sell that back to them. So now let's look at sort of the reality, right? The reality of living the life. This is a quote that I took from this study that was conducted in New York. And what the study starts off saying is that when we did these interviews, we wanted to use the same language that the participants used. And so they asked what sort of, how did they refer to this quote, sex trade? And they said some people refer to it as sex work, or prostitution, tricking, hustling. And then the final word that they used was the word surviving. And that really hit me to think about. The life is really about trying to figure out how to survive. And one of the big ones is you've got to obey the rules, whether explicit or implicit. And those things can be everything from, what we think of as the prostitution itself. It can be other criminal activity, can even be part and parcel of, conducting the operation. That's kind of a neutral, way to talk about, advertising, driving, renting hotel rooms, all of those types of things. I wanted to hear from either one of you about how important this idea was for you in that life when you were there, this idea of obeying the rules.
Yeah, it was number one.
Go
You
ahead,
had
Wendy.
to obey the rules. Yeah, I mean, if I did not obey another thing that our trafficker did was he was really good at knowing what punishment works best. So my punishment, he knows what would affect me the worst is if he beat somebody else and told me this is your fault. My punishment was somebody else. I had to sit there and watch them get beat. So I never broke the rules. So when he told me get in the car and drive, I would get in the car and I would drive. I was obeying the rules. The other part of that is, there's, 3 or 4 14 to 16-year-old girls in the car and I'm driving them to go turn tricks. My brain can only see, I don't want her to get beat up, so I'm going to do whatever he tells me to do. So Keisha?
For me, psychologically, I've always been compliant just from childhood abuse. I learned very early on to just do what adults tell you, and that transferred into my trafficking experience. But one thing I often tell people, when you have to make the connections, like in slavery, what would happen to a slave if they disobeyed the master? Those same consequences. This is a continuum of that. So those same consequences exist in this realm of existence in reality today. So yeah, I did whatever I needed to do to get through the next 24 hours when it all boils down. Like when I look back, I don't beat myself up about it because I know I had to do those things. I can't even imagine what would have happened if I didn't do those things, just by the visual things that I saw Sir Charles do to people. I was doing a training once with a law enforcement officer, and he said that Sir Charles was so arrogant that he had shot a man on the track, and he didn't even leave. When the police pulled up, he didn't even leave. And the man was there, and this adult male was too afraid to say, Sir Charles shot me. That's how terrified people were of him. And me being 16, I was 10 times more terrified of him. So yeah, if Sir Charles would have told me to do anything to save my life and the life of my children, I think I would have done it. So yeah, obey the rules. You just know to obey whatever that, and that led to also criminal activity. At age 18, I got my first felony for having to cash money orders for him in my name with my ID. So yeah, the criminal activity, and that's something it still affects me at the age of 40 today. It still affects me, my housing, employment, all those things. So
Yeah, and I'll do a shameless plug because the next webinar in this series is really about that piece of it, right? The perceived criminal activity that's being done, and trying to get a better handle on assessing culpability in situations like this. So put a bookmark in that and really try to dig in deep next time. So I've got in the next sort of 8 slides are pieces of the Biderman's chart of coercion. And I'm not sure how many people have seen this before. There's a link to one of the resources about it here in the slide, and we can make it available to you otherwise. But what it is it's basically this chart of coercion that has been used to better understand things like cult behavior, brainwashing, Stockholm syndrome. And so what we have on the left-hand side is the tactic, right? What is the offender doing? The offender is using this tactic. And the result of the tactic is various sort of ways to make a victim more compliant. And so the first one, and I'm going to go through these, and Wendy and Keisha, like, speak up if you have anything you want to add to these, because I know we've already kind of touched on a lot of them just in you guys talking about your experiences. But this idea of isolation, right? And it's not just physical isolation, although sometimes it is that as well, but it can, deprive a victim of any sort of outside support systems. It can make the victim very dependent on their abuser for everything.
I think for our isolation, it was our group. It was like we were allowed to speak to each other. I mean, usually he controlled anywhere between 4 to 10 girls at any given time. So there would be him and then 4 to 10 girls all living under his direction. And we were like, it was almost like we were a silo in itself, because we weren't allowed to talk to other people on the outside unless they were tricks. There was only, we weren't allowed to talk to, go out into society. We were afraid of society. He instilled fear. Them people, don't like us.
Yeah, I think that speaks to that middle one here, where you guys all have to be together as this unit, and that adds to the stability, which allows him to control you more, right?
Yeah.
For me, it was more of my age too that played a major factor, because I was underage. I couldn't get access to things I didn't have. I wasn't old enough. I couldn't even rent a hotel room if I wanted to have a place where I can run away to on my own. I had to depend on him or other people for everything. So that created a vulnerability and isolation. Like, I'll just deal with him and and he handles it.
Did he help you get your ID?
At 18, well, I got my ID when I ran away from him once. So I did get my ID. I got a job, lost the job, ended up having to go back to him. And that happened several times. No,
Yeah.
He did not help me get an ID. He had fraudulent ID, birth certificates, social security cards, and IDs for all of us to use.
So the next one we have is this idea that an offender is going to try to control your perception of everything, so that everything is viewed through the lens of your trafficker, and eliminates any other information that is not totally in line with what the trafficker says. And in line with that, they will punish really anything that you dare show that looks like independence or resistance. I think one of the more interesting things is the last one, which is how they do it, right? It's not always out of fear and threats and violence. It can also be through charm and seductiveness to make sure that their demands are met.
Yeah, one time I asked a group of survivors, what is one word that outsiders would have labeled your trafficker, if they saw him, if they met him, and every single one of them, charming.
Mm.
Everybody loved my trafficker. My mom, my dad, everybody loved him because they didn't know the truth. They saw that charming side. They saw the side of him that everybody loved.
And that's a great tactic to escape accountability, right?
Mhm.
I'll pitch in here. I was trying a case with a trafficker who I knew. This was, that very charming. The victim had shared that with me. But when I was in the middle of trial, I actually got these really dirty looks from corrections officers. There was 2 female corrections officers that were giving me the look like, how dare I be prosecuting this man? And I realized that charm, that charm doesn't end with the victims. That charm is used on law enforcement, on prosecutors, like you said, on other parents and other folks involved as well. It's really powerful and it's effective.
Yeah.
So this next one is this idea, and I think maybe more obvious to a lot of folks, is humiliation or degradation. And that can be making victims feel just incompetent to resist. And also, any resistance is found to be more costly than just remaining compliant. Threats, I think these are one of the more obvious ones. We understand how people control people with threats and with violence. But it can look different ways. I love how both of you have described the fact that a trafficker figures out what buttons to push, and they're not the same buttons for everyone. But it's something that's going to create such anxiety and such despair that it is able to have the power that it needs to have.
Yeah, I'll throw in here one of Greg's victims, the only thing he ever had to do to control her, he never had to beat her, he never hit her, the only threat he ever made is he would walk over to the telephone, pick it up, look her right in the eye and say, "Do you want me to call your mother right now and let her know exactly what you've been doing?" She would just break down. "Please, Greg, please don't call my mom. Please, Greg, don't call my mom." Greg had total control over her for 2 years based solely on she did not want her mom to know that she had prostituted.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, Sir Charles, the night that he took me to the track, as he was giving me the rules and how much to charge and for positions, and I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And he looked me in my eye and he said, "You're going to do that, or I'm going to do something to your daughter." So that I knew right then that I was in a situation where I could not just walk away from, because I took him to see my daughter. I showed him where my godparents stayed. So all those things began to play in my head. Like, if I leave and he's threatened me, he could possibly not harm me, only he can harm the people that I love. And I would rather sacrifice myself than have something happen to them. So yeah, the threats are very real.
And that goes right into this next one, which is demonstrating omnipotence or superiority of power. I mean, it's clear that Sir Charles had made it very clear that he was an incredibly powerful man and that any resistance was futile, and that he had the ability to carry out those threats, right? So those two in combination.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he was very, very popular, very well connected, especially with law enforcement. We used to do private parties and things like that. So very connected within the community. He was a loan shark. Like, people needed their bills paid and they didn't have enough money, they would go to him. He would loan them the money. Very, very connected to the community. And everybody knows of him. If you listen to the radio at 6 o'clock, you'll hear his name in the intro. So just even today, in 2020. So very connected within our community. I call him the Hugh Hefner of the hood. So
Wow.
Got to find some humor in that.
Yes.
This is the next one, which is this idea of enforcing trivial demands. And I think that comes into play with some of the rules that you speak of, right? And sometimes the rules are just these little demands, but what they do is by enforcing them, it reinforces who really has power and control, whether that be, who you can talk to, or whether it be, how you have to put the money into his hands.
Or I'll just say we would, oh, I remember, oh, yeah, just driving over a speed bump. If we drove over a speed bump too fast in his car, and he would usually make us always drive. And so, but they were all his cars, even though most of them were in my name. But if you went over a speed bump too fast, you would get beat. And so I would watch these other girls get beat. And it was just like, it's this power and control. I control, he controlled everything that we did.
And this one is this idea of exhaustion, right? And whether that be keeping you up all night, keeping you up on drugs, but really just weakens your ability to physically or mentally resist, and really can put you in a state of just confusion. And then of course this would prevent you from making, your escape plans or thinking of ways to get out of it because you're too exhausted to do it.
And for me, my trafficker was always 2 steps ahead of you. He could sense when you were by the communication, like he could sense a change in your behavior like no other. And I remember like my 3, I had completely lost the ability to even think, like how you have thoughts and processing. I remember just waking up and going to work, waking up, going to work 7 days a week, no holidays off, no days off, and doing that for consistently. Like you are exhausted. And I'm talking about you're walking the streets late from 8 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning, and having trauma done to your body constantly running from predators who were not buyers but actually trying to kill you. You just never knew what the person was up to when you got in the car. You didn't know the motive, so you were always on a heightened sense of awareness. And then when you're able to lay down, you just crash and you like dead sleep, no dreaming, just dead sleep. And then he wakes you up, time to get ready for work, what you want to eat and things, quick meal, back out the door, that consistently. Yeah, you're exhausted.
I think what Keisha just described for me was that's what happens when there's no more hope, no more dreams. There's no more hope. There's no more dreams. There's no hope that you're ever going to live outside of this. And that brings on a whole nother level of exhaustion / depression that mixes in. And yeah, you cannot even see that reality of what you're living because it is so depressing. And just having no hopes and no dreams is just survival. Just, can I make it another hour? Just imagine for a minute, just not even being able to see your life a week from now.
I think that's a good segue into this next one, which is the occasional indulgences, and why that is actually a part of the control and the coercion, rather than thinking of it as like some sort of benefit that you're receiving. This is actually part of the coercion, is the occasional indulgences.
Because they have to continue to feed you that want or need. Remember, mine was, I want a happy family. So occasionally he would get us all together and we would all go to the beach for the day. We would just go hang out at the beach all day. I mean, and that was like, oh my gosh, the funnest thing ever. There was, I had another thought, but I can't think of it. For me, it was, just, I love you, or one single rose. If he would just bring me a rose occasionally and just say, I love you. and not one of those fake I love yous. He would give me an authentic I love you. And it would mean so much to me. And it would remind me why I'm living in this hell. I'm choosing, because they make you think that this is your choice. I'm choosing to live through this hell because someday I'm going to get that he's going to really truly love me, and it's just going to be us.
And I think this goes into the next slide, which I added because as a prosecutor, this would be a really common tactic from the defense attorney, is that they would go on to, the victim's social media, or they'd see pictures, and they would show me these pictures of, the listed victim in the case as looking like they're having a great time. They just bought a new expensive purse. They're at a great restaurant. They're out at the club. But it was hard for me to figure out, okay, how do I articulate that? That's just, it looks good. Maybe it even feels good. Like you said, that day on the beach, but it doesn't mean that this is still not this really coercive, terrible situation. If you were to, I was going to say, how would you tell a prosecutor to deal with this?
It goes back to the social construct. I mean, we come up with these assumptions that precedes reality, and it's not. I mean, that's just part of business as usual. You have to. I remember Sir Charles being in a club with us and grooming us and telling us who to go to. Not really grooming, but telling us who to push up on and to get him to spend money. And so we had to play the parts. And it also, for me, it goes back to this disassociation. I had to become these characters in my mind to survive and in those moments, that's who I had to be, because I knew I couldn't be anything other than that. So yes, marketing. It goes right to the marketing of you as being the product, and you have to be marketed well and look good, because no one wants, you wouldn't go in the grocery store and get the rotten fruit. You want the fruit that looks the healthiest, the best, and that's what you're going to spend your money on. So it's the same analogy goes into the traffickers and how they view their some traffickers and how they view the women that they're victimizing.
And we know when it's bad, it's really bad. And we've talked about the fact that there are punishments. Obviously, you're subject to arrest, and there's sexual and physical violence sort of always out there, at the hands of sort of multiple people, right? And I think it's obvious, the traffickers and the buyers, but I was interested when you mentioned the community, Keisha, and how you felt harmed by the community.
When I look back at my experience, the feedback or the perceptions that I got from my community hurt me the worst, because being out in my community where I grew up from a baby, and being on the street, like I actually now work on the street that I was trafficked on. My window faces the same street, and having people just roll down their windows and say things to me verbally insulting, and threats, people threatened to harm me if I didn't get off the corner, get off my street, things like that. I was constantly in harm's way, just being out there. So yeah, my community and the invisibility. No one once stopped and said, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Nothing. Even now, when I see women on the street, I stop and I give them a card. We have a program. If you need help, you don't have to leave the life right now. It's not about that. It's about making sure you have access to the things that you need, food, clothing, things like that. So just being visible. I see you. I see you out here. I see your situation. and I want to help you. And we don't do that. And that's what community is about. Seeing people in need and reaching out, because I would have took Cole to help if I could have had the opportunity.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so along with sort of these harms, right, and everything from that physical violence, the threats, that feeling of worthlessness, and like you talking about, nobody's even asking if I'm okay. Broken trust, and simple things of like, I don't know how to get a job or housing, and my inability to do that. I'm curious about the coping mechanisms, right? And how that translates into how you survive through that.
Do you want me to go first? Or well, for this, I just remember like Greg, we were required to give all of our money to Greg. And if we wanted anything, we would have to either ask him for it, in which typically he would say, no, go steal it from the store. I mean, this is everything from food to feminine hygiene needs, to rubbers, to my children's needs. Everything had to be stolen. And so, yeah, I mean, we had to go in, we had to steal. And, so of course I have a bunch of theft charges, on my record now. And so, and then victimizing others. I mean, just the one thought that came into my head now was, I remember the times that he would make a couple of the girls beat up a new girl, or, another one of the, I have no idea why, but yeah, like he would make some of the girls beat up the other girls. So Keisha?
For me, my biggest has been masking, just masking how I truly felt. Like I don't remember getting, I was so into, I call them characters. I was so into the character that I had to just survive the 24 hours that I was given. Personality disorders, this has really had an effect on my mental health. A lot of mental health of other survivors. And for me, the thing that I have to look myself in the mirror is when I became the victimizer, like when I began to victimize others just to spare myself, and have to survive in that mode. That's the hardest, because I have this quote that says, you don't understand the power of forgiveness until it's you that needs to be forgiven. And the effect that I had on other lives just because I was in survival mode. Because survival mode, it makes you deplete everything around you, all your resources, just so that you can live. So those were my coping mechanisms, and those are some of the things that I that hunt me even today.
So thinking about that, and then thinking about, sort of the next step, which is transitioning from the life. And this was originally called exiting the life, and we changed it because, when we were talking about it, I think Keisha, you came up with this quote. Maybe it was Wendy, I'm sorry. But it was, it was really powerful to think about it as really a two-part process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's one thing to leave the trafficker, it's another to leave the life. I was with my trafficker only about 1.5 to 2 years all together, considering that I did leave a few times and went back. But I was in the life for a total of 10 years, because when I did leave the trafficker, I still had things that created barriers for me, like a criminal record. So I have always had to depend on others to get access to housing. That has been one of my greatest barriers, having to get into toxic relationships just to have a roof over my head. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, you flipped the slides.
I did.
I'm trying to read.
No, I think you're touching on it. We've got, these are an amalgamation of some things that that we know make it really hard, right? Everything from those systems of like housing to the feelings of futility, right? Because you've got all these barriers.
Even even the ones that you wouldn't consider, even understanding, like the women that I work with, one of their biggest barriers is childcare. And so you can't get a job without childcare. So, and with childcare, if you get assistance with childcare, you can't make over $8 and something an hour. So if you get a job making $10, you lose your childcare. So those are the barriers that exist that nobody knows about. Like, why does she choose to stay in these rundown apartments? Why is she choosing? Because she can't get access to anything else, because there are barriers within the system that creates that. I want to say not create, but it causes, it speaks to the oppression that exists in society.
I think some of it is just, I mean, you have to realize, I met my trafficker when I was 15, and my rescue came in the form of a 2-year prison sentence when I was 29 years old. So here's this 15-year chunk of time where when everybody else was, learning about high school civics, okay, I have no idea, college experience, going out, making friends, getting your first job, getting fired from your first job or quitting your first job, all of those experiences we're lacking. We don't have the social skills or the social knowledge of how to navigate through life. I know for me, a big portion of it was I literally could not say a sentence without it consisting of one or more swear words. And this was just common to me. Everything was, an F or an A or a B or whatever, and it was so ingrained in us that this is just the way we spoke. So here I'm out trying to live in a new life, trying to make friends with normal people. And well, they don't want to be friends with me because every other word coming out of my mouth is a swear word, but I don't connect it. It wasn't until years later that somebody said, Wendy, do you realize you swear a lot? And I was like, huh? What do you mean? And then I realized I started trying, it was like, oh my gosh, I swear I'm throwing up swear words. No wonder nobody wants to be around me. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to it than anybody realizes. And that, puts a person back into depression,
You're doing a great job today, Wendy.
Oh, thanks.
Nary a swear word around.
Thank you.
So I think you talked about this, Keisha, that, you have these services, but they're not necessarily actually accessible, right? There may be childcare, but there's this limit on when you can reach it, or these benefits may not be available because of your criminal history. And sadly, law enforcement has not really demonstrated historically that they are a safe place. And so I think that's kind of one of the things this initiative is hoping to help out with. But I wanted to, either one of you maybe to talk about this one is sort of the known of this reality of like, it's hard to leave because it's the only thing I know. And this is reinforced by your trafficker, right? That you can't be accepted outside of this either.
And the saddest part is when that's validated. When you do try to go out and you do try to get your grant, because there were times when I could get access to employment and things would go great for 3 months, and then something would happen. I would be late for work, because you also have to understand the anxiety that goes into going in, like, you don't go from the life into corporate America. I mean, if you can, it's great, but typically there is a process that goes, there's a lot of healing. There's a lot of other things that has to take place before you get to that point. And so I would go out, I would feel strong about it, get employment, and then something happens, and then I find myself without any money and needing search halls, and I'll go right back, and he'll tell you, I told you how hard it was. See what why I exist. Like, this is why I exist, because I make things happen. With me, you've never been hungry. With me, you've never been homeless. We've always had our utilities paid. And when all of our money is put together, we can have access to anything we want. And those things were validated through him. So that was the hardest thing, to really go out there and try and just hit your head on these glass ceilings time and time again and realize, wow, I do need him. That does make sense. And you begin to believe those untruths. And it keeps you stuck.
I guess I just like to say no one else understands, but I didn't even understand. How on earth can I get somebody to understand when I don't even know? Why am I with this guy? You know, it took me years to realize that he was just using me. He didn't love me. And that was painful. It was painful to realize that the one person in this world, the one person who promised me that they did love me, didn't really love me, which kind of makes me unlovable. So there's this whole entire, not only do they not understand, I don't understand what's happening. And I think that is a huge barrier when, you know, you walk up to somebody, let's just say, you know, a homeless person on a street, you know, help me to understand how you ended up here. Well, they probably can't even they don't understand it. They don't know, just because not only the physical barriers that continue, you don't know how to write a check. You don't know how to get a bank account. You can't get a bank account because you have a record. You know, you can't have that job. Well, you can't live there. I mean, I'll tell you, it's been 20 years since my conviction, 20 years. And still, my criminal record defines where I can work, where I cannot work, where I can live, where I cannot live. I was just denied an apartment building because of a conviction from 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that brings us to sort of this last piece, and we're sort of setting ourselves up for the whole initiative, right? Because what we're looking for is to figure out, now that we know more about what the realities are, how can we use that information to improve our responses, right? So we know that historically, there have been intersections with law enforcement that have been really bad. Sexual assault, quid pro quo, arrest, jail, prison, and then all those collateral consequences that come from that. But I know both of you also share, glimmers of hope for us, right? And things that have been effective with your interactions with law enforcement. And I was hoping you could share some of that.
For me, I don't know if Keisha wants to go first or not, but I think for me, I remember a time where a police officer, typically when I would get pulled over, we were treated very poorly, we don't want you here, get off our streets. If I see you again, I'm putting you in jail. They only reinforced what Greg already told me. You're not wanted out there. They hate you. And I remember one time a police officer was being pulled over, and I was just like, okay, I was just waiting to be treated poorly again. And I remember he walked up to me and he said, listen, I know what you're doing out here. I know what you're doing out here, and so do you, but I don't want to put you in a position to have to lie to me. So we're going to bypass that question altogether. But I do have one question for you, and I would really appreciate if you would tell me the truth. And I just remember sitting there just kind of shocked, like, what on earth can this question possibly be? And then he just looked at me and said, are you okay? Yeah. At that point, I was 25 years old. And I think that was the only time anybody had ever asked me authentically, are you okay? If my experiences with police officers over and over again were like that, I would have asked for help. I would have realized there are safe people out here, but it just seemed like whatever Greg was telling us, it was reinforced by the interactions that we had with the outsiders. Keisha?
For me, my intersection with law enforcement has strengthened and healed just doing this work. I've trained over 10,000 law enforcement officers, and just the response that I get within the city now is way different from 20 years ago. And I know that comes from the training and the work that survivor leaders have been doing to inform law enforcement and get them to understand our situations and experiences. But yeah, just getting a call from a law enforcement officer now saying, hey, I have a young lady in the car that needs help. Do you have any services, or can I bring her to the Haven House to get services? And they bring them here. So just having that partnership and collaboration with them so that the young lady don't go to jail, and know that there's a place where you can come and have the support system that you need to rebuild or build up the strength to leave your trafficker. That has been very enlightening to me, and I'm glad to see that shift within this work. So I know it's a long way to go, but yeah, the victims are women are being actually seen as victims within our community.
And I think one of our goals is also to have folks start looking beyond the arrest, right? So, you know, as you said, you've got a charge. I think it's easy when it's a prostitution arrest. I think we're doing really well there. But when it's an arrest for theft, or I know, Keisha, yours was for forgery.
Yeah, I have 14. I'm still on 20-year probation, even now. So, yeah, and those are overlooked. And even now that I'm trying to fight it or get vacatur, is how can you prove this was related to being trafficked? Those kind of, but it all is all really, I was in the light, and these were the decisions I was making based off of that experience. So it has to be related. Yeah. Because if this had not happened to me, I'm sure that my life would have took a totally different trajectory than what it did. So, and I've been home 10 years and no arrest, no life, no. So it is possible for rehabilitation to be restored. So.
And I know Georgia just changed their law, so we're hopeful that we can have some changes. And the next 2 webinars, you'll get notices, everyone that was on here today. But the next one's is assessing culpability, context before conviction. And then the third one is achieving justice for victims, and what the prosecutor's role in things like expungement review and being proactive about that are included. So please note, we're going to continue this conversation. But from here on, we want you guys to really think about recognizing the systematic racism and complex trauma that are major push factors when it comes to trafficking, and also our systematic response. And thinking about how identifiers, how offenders are using all those different coercive control tactics, like on a very individualized basis, right? They're good at what they do. And one of the things that they're really good at is escaping accountability, because we're unable to see the more nuanced ways that this coercive control happens. And then thinking forward, let's consider how the criminal justice system, knowing what we know, how we can do better to provide off-ramps from this exploitation. So I want to give a huge thanks to Wendy and Keisha. Our program, our funders are the Novo Foundation, are funding us. We're going to do some targeted work with some jurisdictions around the country. If you're interested in learning more, you can contact us at AEquitas. This is my information. Wendy, this is yours. You've got an amazing book on Amazon. The link's here. I'll let you say your closing words.
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending today, and feel free to reach out to me, or read it in my book. You can see, what, how my life transpired, and, where I am today. And so I thank you all for being open enough to listen, because many times people don't want to take the time to learn about this. So thank you.
Keisha, you want to say a little thanks? And we're right at our time. Well done.
If you need to reach out to me for anything, I'm available. My email is there, and the organization that I work for. If you have any survivors that you know are or victims that need services, we're here in Atlanta. If you're in Atlanta, we're here to serve.
Thank you so much for being here. Keisha and Wendy, every time we get together and talk about this, I learned so much. And I thank you for just, as Jerry said, just being really real with us and sharing that experience. I think it'll be helpful. So thanks, everyone. You should get a follow-up email. I put in the chat a link to the racial roots of human trafficking, that study we talked about at the very beginning. I know Jen was putting in some other links. We've got a webinar on drug facilitated human trafficking. I know somebody asked about that specifically, but we're really excited about this new initiative, and we hope you join us for the rest of our webinars and reach out whenever you can. So thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.